Every morning the same woman walked through the door of Marcus Hale's diner. Worn jacket, tired eyes, always ordering the cheapest thing on the menu. Some days she didn't have enough to cover it. Marcus never said a word about it. He just quietly adjusted the bill, slipped a little extra onto her plate, and moved on. He told himself it meant nothing, just a small thing. The kind of thing decent people do without thinking. But the morning she didn't show up, 4 men in suits walked in instead, and they were looking for him by name. Marcus Hale had worked the morning shift at Carver's Diner for going on 6 years, and in that time, he had learned exactly how to disappear inside a routine. He arrived before sunrise, brewed the first pot of coffee, wiped down the counter, and set the tables the same way every single day. The diner sat on a corner in a quiet part of the city. Nothing fancy, nothing memorable, just a place where people stopped in before work and left without looking back. Marcus suited that kind of place. He wasn't the type to be looked at or remembered. He had wanted something different once. Back in his late 20s, he had trained seriously in a kitchen. Not this kind of kitchen, not short-order eggs and reheated soup, but real cooking. He had worked under a chef who told him he had instincts that couldn't be taught. He had believed it for a while. Then life shifted in the way it does for certain people, quietly and without ceremony, and the path he had been on simply closed. He didn't talk about that. He came to work, he did his job, and he went home. That was enough. Or at least it had been enough for long enough that he'd stopped questioning it. She first came in on a Tuesday in early October. Marcus noticed her, the way he noticed most people who walked through that door briefly, and without much interest. She took the table near the window, the one with the wobbly leg that most regulars avoided. She studied the menu longer than it warranted, given how short it was, and when Marcus came over, she ordered the smallest coffee and a single piece of toast. She paid in coins, counted out carefully, and left a tip that amounted to less than a quarter. He thought nothing of it, but she came back the next morning. And the one after that. By the end of that first week, Marcus knew her order before she sat down, and he had started to notice things he hadn't intended to notice. The jacket she wore was too thin for October. The bag she carried looked like it had been repaired more than once with electrical tape. She never used her phone. He wasn't even sure she had one. She would sit by the window, wrap both hands around the cup, and stare at the street, like she was working something out in her head that had no clean answer. Her name, he learned eventually, was Elena. Not from her, she never offered it. He caught it one morning when she paid with a battered debit card that he only glanced at because the machine was slow. Elena Brooks. The name didn't mean anything to him. He filed it away without thinking about it, and moved on. There were mornings the card declined. The first time it happened, she looked up at him with an expression that was not embarrassment. Exactly. It was something quieter than that. More like a person who had already decided not to feel embarrassed about certain things, because feeling anything about them cost too much energy. Marcus told her the machine had been glitchy all week, and waved it off. She looked at him for a moment, then looked back down at the table and said, "Thank you," in a voice that was barely above speaking. He refilled her coffee and went back behind the counter. After that, he started making small adjustments he told himself didn't count as anything significant. The toast became 2 slices without a change in price. The coffee appeared before she ordered it. On mornings when the card declined again, and it did more than once, he simply didn't mention it, just marked it as paid in the system and let it go. He wasn't doing it to be kind, he told himself. He was doing it because it was easier than the alternative, and because the diner wasn't busy enough in the early hours for it to matter financially. He was good at convincing himself of things like that. What he hadn't expected was the way she began to watch him. It started gradually, a glance that lasted a second longer than it needed, to a stillness in the way she sat when he was moving around the diner. She wasn't obvious about it. Most people wouldn't have caught it. But Marcus spent his mornings moving between tables and the counter and the kitchen pass, and he developed a low-grade awareness of where everyone in the room was at any given moment. That was just the job. And so he noticed without meaning to that Elena Brooks watched him the way someone watches a thing they're trying to understand. She never asked him anything personal. He never asked her anything at all. The arrangement between them, if it could even be called that, operated entirely in the space between words. She came in, he served her. She sat for somewhere between 30 minutes and an hour, and then she left. There were mornings she looked exhausted beyond the ordinary kind of tired. There were mornings she looked like she was carrying something that had no physical weight, but was heavy in a way that had nothing to do with her bag. Marcus didn't ask about any of it. That wasn't his place. And beyond that, he simply understood that some people weren't looking to be asked. By November, she had become part of the rhythm of his morning, the same way the coffee machine's sound had become part of it, or the particular creak the door made when the temperature dropped. He didn't think about her when she wasn't there. She was just a fixture, a constant one of the handful of things that made Tuesday feel like Tuesday, and not just another unmarked day. Which was why the morning she didn't come in, something shifted in a way he wasn't prepared for. He noticed at 7:45, which was when she usually pushed through the door. He had already set out her cup. He waited until 8, then until 8:30, and he kept finding small reasons to glance toward the entrance, checking the weather through the glass, watching the foot traffic things that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with her. By 9 o'clock, he had filled her cup himself and left it on the counter just to have something to do with his hands, and then he'd felt foolish about it and poured it out. He couldn't have explained what it was that unsettled him. She owed him nothing. He owed her nothing. They had never had a real conversation. He didn't know where she lived, or what she did, or why she had been coming to this particular diner on this particular corner every morning for 6 weeks. He had no reason to feel the particular quality of absence that her not being there produced. But the feeling was there regardless, lodged somewhere just below his sternum, quiet and persistent. At 9:15 the door opened. Marcus looked up automatically the way he always did, and what he saw was not Elena Brooks. What he saw were 4 men in dark suits moving through the entrance, with the deliberate, unhurried quality of people who had never in their lives been uncertain about whether they belonged somewhere. They were not the kind of men who ate breakfast at a place like Carver's Diner. The suits were too clean and too fitted. 2 of them positioned themselves just inside the door, without sitting, and their eyes moved around the room in a way that was professional rather than curious. The other 2 walked directly to the counter. The one who stepped forward was older, with silver at his temples, and a leather briefcase that looked like it cost more than Marcus made in a month. He didn't look at the menu. He didn't look at the specials board. He looked at Marcus with the focused, calibrated expression of a man who had already confirmed what he needed to know before walking through the door. "Marcus Hale," the man said. Marcus set down the cloth he'd been using to wipe the counter. "That's me. My name is Raymond Stokes. I'm an attorney." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a card which he placed on the counter with 2 fingers, precisely like a man, accustomed to small gestures carrying large weight. "We need to speak with you privately. It concerns a matter of significant legal importance." He said it the way people say things that they know will require a moment to land. Then he added, "It concerns Elena Brooks." Marcus looked at the card. He looked at the 4 men. He looked at the empty table near the window with the wobbly leg. The coffee cup he'd set out that morning was still sitting where he'd left it, before he'd remembered to pour it out. And he hadn't poured it out, after all, he realized. He'd just walked away from it. It sat there, empty, and waiting in the particular silence of things that have already changed before you understand that they have. Raymond Stokes did not explain anything inside the diner. He simply asked Marcus if he could step away for an hour, said it with the kind of professional courtesy that made the request feel less like a question and more like something that had already been decided. Marcus told his manager there was a personal matter, untied his apron, and followed the attorney out to a black car idling at the curb. The 2 men who had stood by the door went with them. The other 2 stayed behind, which struck Marcus as the kind of detail that meant something, though he couldn't have said what. The law office was on the 14th floor of a building downtown that Marcus had walked past hundreds of times without ever having a reason to enter. The lobby had marble floors and a reception desk staffed by 2 people who looked up when he came in and then looked carefully away. Stokes led him to a conference room with a long table and windows that looked out over the city. There was water on the table and a folder and nothing else. Marcus sat down. He felt the particular discomfort of a man who was wearing the wrong clothes for a room. Stokes sat across from him, opened the folder, and began without preamble. Elena Brooks, he said, was not who Marcus had believed her to be. She had not been struggling. She had not been short on money. The debit card that occasionally declined had been a card she kept funded at a deliberately low balance. A deliberate choice maintained deliberately for reasons that the letter she had left would explain. Stokes slid a single sheet across the table and let that sit there a moment before he continued. Elena Brooks, he said, was the chief executive officer of Meridian Group, a privately held company with interests in healthcare infrastructure, real estate development, and logistics, with annual revenues that Stokes named in a figure Marcus had to hear twice before it registered. She had run the company for 11 years. She had been diagnosed 14 months ago with a progressive neurological condition that her medical team had assessed as terminal. She had known for the past several months that she had limited time remaining. She had died 4 days ago at a private care facility outside the city, with no family present by her own instruction. Marcus sat with that for a moment. The window behind Stokes framed the skyline gray and flat under November cloud cover. He thought about the way she used to hold her coffee cup with both hands. He thought about the table with the wobbly leg. He didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say yet that would have been the right thing. Stokes continued. Elena's estate included the entirety of her stake in Meridian Group's several properties and a range of financial assets. Her will executed 8 months prior and updated twice since named Marcus Hale as the primary beneficiary of the majority of that estate, with specific directives attached regarding how portions of it were to be used. Stokes said this with the same measured professional flatness he had used for everything else, as if the size of what he was describing was not the kind of thing that required a different tone. What came next, however, required a different tone. A second attorney entered the room, a woman named Carla Voss, sharp-featured with the slightly combative energy of someone representing a position rather than a person. She represented, Stokes explained, a coalition of Meridian's board members and several minority stakeholders. They had concerns, she said, about the circumstances of the bequest. Specifically, they had concerns about Marcus. They wanted to understand the nature of his relationship with Elena, and whether that relationship had been appropriately, she chose the word, carefully independent. The implication was not subtle. Marcus had been a waiter at a diner. Elena had been a vulnerable woman with a terminal diagnosis who had, by her own design, placed herself in a position of apparent financial dependence. The board's position, Voss explained in the language of corporate caution, was that the conditions under which Elena had made her decisions warranted scrutiny. They were not, she was careful to say, making accusations. They were raising questions. They were exercising due diligence on behalf of the company and its stakeholders. Marcus listened to all of it and understood, without needing it spelled out further, that what they were actually saying was that he had no business being in this room, and they intended to prove it. He drove himself back to the diner afterward. He sat in the parking lot for a while without going inside. Then he went and told his manager he needed to take the rest of the day and drove home.